Well, hello and welcome to ITWire TV. My name is Alex Zaharovrojt, and in today's episode, I'm joined by Claroty's Regional Vice President of Australia and New Zealand, Leon Poggioloi, to discuss the ongoing cybersecurity risks facing Australia's critical infrastructure sectors. Leon, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Alex. It's great to be here.
Thanks for taking the time. Now, before we speak about the dangers faced by our critical infrastructure sectors, what else do we need to know about Claroty, both in 2025 and in the age of ever-advanced AI that can be used by both protective companies like yours and by threat actors wanting to cause havoc on a global basis?
So when people come and ask me, who are Claroty? Basically, I tell people we've been around since the infancy of OT cybersecurity, which is really only going back the last 10 years.
And just quickly for those who want to know, what's OT again? I'm sure most people watching will know, but just in case.
No, great question. OT refers to operating technology, which is the things like the industrial control systems that control manufacturing facilities, power stations, water treatment plants, things like that. What's really interesting, Alex, over the last few years in particular, is that what used to be just OT has now morphed into what we're calling CPS, or cyber physical systems, which is all of those connected technology devices that are involved in the physical process. So things like building management systems like CCTV cameras and door access systems, IoT infrastructure, industrial IoT systems, and medical devices that are in a lot of modern connected hospitals.
So that's the definition of cyber physical systems, or CPS. But for those also who need a refresher, and it should be obvious, but what is critical infrastructure for everyone watching?
So critical infrastructure, and there's the Home Affairs definition, which is what's covered under the SOCI Act, things like payment processing and grocery providers and things like that. But certainly when it comes to industrial control systems, critical infrastructure deliver those essential utilities and services that we all rely on to go about our daily lives that maybe become sort of invisible because we just take them for granted. I'm talking about things like reliable electricity, reliable water supply, reliable gas and heating, reliable public transport, road infrastructure, telecommunications. All these sorts of things are essential parts of our digital way of life and the sorts of things we rely on, but they're all delivered by connected technology platforms that are becoming more and more technologically advanced and interconnected, which is bringing new kinds of cyber risk that's Claroty's mission to protect.
I seem to remember vaguely that during the time of the Sydney 2000 Olympics, there was some sort of Telstra pit somewhere with fibre that was discovered that, could have been the subject of some sort of attack. And it's like this has been a concern for a long time.
Yeah, it has, Alex. But it's only now starting to play out more and more and starting to enter the collective consciousness. And I think the Australian Department of Home Affairs has done a really good job, as well as the associated federal entities, putting out legislation like the SOCI Act, like the AES-CSF, which is put out by the Australian Energy Market Operator, to start to put some regulatory frameworks that these critical infrastructure operators can align to in order to protect that infrastructure and continue to deliver the services that Australians all rely on.
Yeah. Look, when I was growing up, if the water or the power went out, it was a bit of a panic. In the modern era, if the Wi-Fi goes out, the kids go into a panic. And in the coming era, if the AI goes out, people won't be able to think anymore. So there's always these definitions for businesses, for governments, and for consumers as to what the critical infrastructure is. And we've all had the pain of an outage. But look, last week, Claroty published its annual State of CPS Security 2025 report into navigating risk in an uncertain economic landscape. So can you please tell me about the key findings and how this applies to companies and critical infrastructure entities, as you just described them, in Australia?
Yeah, no, thanks, Alex. And it's very timely we just brought that report out. We've been running these surveys for a few years now, and every 6-12 months we'll survey the industry and get actual feedback from people in the industry of how cybersecurity incidents might have impacted their organizations. A couple of the key statistics I pulled out, I've got written here, are things like 49% of our respondents have said that supply chain shifts due to geopolitical reasons, and you'd only have to open a newspaper just to see how quickly the chess pieces are moving in the geopolitical landscape right now. Those supply chain shifts are increasing their CPS cyber risk. 76% of respondents said they're expecting to overhaul their cybersecurity strategy due to the emerging cyber regulations, things like the SOCI Act and AES-CSF. So they're evolving their cybersecurity strategies to meet their regulations. And also, interestingly, 73% of respondents said that third-party remote access is being reevaluated as part of their security posture review. One of the other interesting statistics when you dig deeper in the report is that when it came to third-party remote access, not all cyber-physical systems are equal. Organizations were a lot more confident about their secure access into their OT infrastructure, which was 62%, versus other cyber-physical systems like their industrial IoT and their building management systems, where only 35% and 21% respectively felt confident. So they're all different kinds of they're all cyber-physical systems, but they're different classes of cyber-physical systems with very different kinds of risk profiles. And I think a lot of this data applies more generally to Australian organisations. And in the same way, I'm seeing a lot more attention paid with secure access into these critical systems and getting their third-party contractors to adopt the corporate sanctioned Claroty systems to access OT versus each contractor wanting to use their own methods of accessing what is an organisation's OT systems.
And yeah, look, it's been part of science fiction movies for a while. We had the Die Hard series where one of them was all about the critical infrastructure being hacked into by foreign nation states. And then the movie with Tom Cruise, Mission Impossible, The Final Reckoning, was all about AI taking over all of the systems globally, and especially the nuclear launch systems to blow up the world and take over. I guess the AI wanted to rule over ashes. But getting back to reality, I mean, in addition to disruptions to the global supply chain, how is the ongoing evolution of digital transformation, now turbocharged by AI, and we just spoke about all the sci-fi stuff, but how is all this blurring into the lines between operational technology and information technology, and what do chief information security officers need to do to secure this critical infrastructure, especially now that systems which, as I was mentioning before, were once air-gapped, are increasingly connected to the internet?
Yeah, look, great observation, Alex. And one of the ways I like to keep it simple when I'm explaining this to people is that OT systems are undergoing a mega trend now, very similarly to how digital transformation was undergone in IT networks over the last 10 to 15 years. You know, there's a lot more increased digitization. AI is certainly playing a part in a lot of these systems. There's a lot more external connectivity and a lot more automation going into these systems to maintain their competitiveness, improve their efficiency, and also improve safety in these systems. So what's happened, this new digital transformation that's occurring in cyber physical systems has brought with it a commensurate new level of cyber risk that didn't exist before. And I'm glad you mentioned the air gap approach, because I do still come across the air gap mentality occasionally. And there's I think, a false sense of security people have when they assume that because a system is isolated from the outside world, or the strategy is to isolate that system from the outside world, that's the cybersecurity box ticked. And when someone mentions an air gap mentality to protect those systems, I have three questions for them to challenge that and suggest a better approach. So number one is, how do you know the air gap is actually there unless you're monitoring that network for external connections? So even if you do have an air gap strategy and maintain an air gap, you should still have some level of monitoring for critical control verification. Now, question number two is, every time you're updating or changing that network, the air gap is broken. So again, how do you monitor and ensure that those critical controls are in place and those updates haven't interfered with the system maliciously? And then finally, even if you do have an air gap that you're maintaining, what about the insider threat to those systems where an internal user might be interfering with the system in the wrong way? And for those three reasons, I say to people that the main thing an air gap achieves is actually a false sense of security. Because without the critical control verification of what's actually happening to the network, you've got no way of confirming whether or not that strategy is in fact working effectively.
It sounds like there's a gap in the air gap approach.
Yeah, great summary, Alex. And that's why I say to people, look, it's a false sense of security, and this is why we encourage people, even in a disconnected system, to monitor those systems. And the reality is that modern OT networks, in order to remain competitive and efficient, they're adopting more and more technology that requires external connectivity and monitoring. It's just not practical in the vast majority of cases to have this kind of approach.
Now, I mentioned the Telstra cables during the Olympics and the science fiction Die Hard and Mission Impossible movies, but what are some examples of successful attacks on critical infrastructure in the real world, and are there any examples of this happening in Australia?
Well, Alex, I think if you class beer as critical infrastructure, and I certainly do, the Lion cyber attack in 2020, I think, is a good example for manufacturers and critical infrastructure operators both to look at what the business impact could be for a system that, for a cyber attack that disables those mission critical systems. Turning back towards more mainstream critical infrastructure, I think a couple of good recent examples that we can use as lessons in securing our own systems. One is the Unitronics cyber attack, which was executed last year for political reasons and exploited things like default password configurations. Certainly alerts went out around the world about changing default passwords on Unitronics devices, but what it really should have said is change default passwords on all OT devices, because they're certainly not the only OT vendor that ships devices with default passwords that, people, when they're implementing those systems, don't put a process in to change those default passwords. So the lesson there is change default passwords for all new devices you're onboarding and put them behind a secure gateway so they aren't as accessible. Another really good example was the Danish power grid cyber attack, which again is very well documented. Back in 2023 it occurred. That exploited a critical vulnerability on a certain version of firewall that some of the operators were using. One of the interesting lessons I took from that is, one operator was affected but didn't even realize they had the vulnerable device in their network until they'd actually been attacked. And so what happened is it turned out that device was installed by a contractor to manage a CCTV network they were installing, which highlights the importance of understanding what's in your network and how it's connected so that you can have the best chance of being able to protect all this cyber physical infrastructure in your OT networks.
Yeah. Well, I mean, just as you were mentioning the default passwords, I mean, I'm sure most technologically astute people have helped friends and family set up routers, and, sometimes you've got to look up on the internet what the default password is for a particular router. And then I've seen modern routers actually asking you to change the password as part of the setup procedure. And so that's, filtered down to consumer land. And, clearly it's still not de rigueur in the enterprise world, and the enterprise people aren't doing it. Otherwise, this wouldn't be a problem. So this makes me think, what standards and regulations exist in Australia? And you have mentioned the SOCI and, the Home Affairs, and you've mentioned various things, but what standards and regulations exist in Australia for critical infrastructure operators to adhere to? And as you just mentioned, with that third-party vendor putting in a firewall which the company didn't know about, how often are these audited?
Yeah, great question, Alex. And, I certainly don't think regulation is going to solve all the world's cybersecurity problems, but it does give organizations a standard to align to and to benchmark themselves against expectations. And as you rightly noted, the primary standards we see are the ASCSF, which is focused on the energy sector, and the SOCI Act, which is focused on those critical infrastructure industries. And these are typically audited on an annual basis. So as well as being prepared to report incidents to the ASD within 12 or 72 hours, depending on the severity, organizations also need to submit a cyber incident response management plan annually to Home Affairs and keep that up to date. So those responsible owners have to develop, maintain, and implement a CIRMP to identify, assess, and mitigate risks, including cybersecurity risks across their physical, cyber, personnel, and supply chain domains. And so some level of monitoring and threat detection and exposure management is required in those critical systems so that they can, alert to incidents and also respond to incidents more quickly. And one recent example that's just hit the news about Jaguar Land Rover having to halt production for, I think, the whole of September so far. I'm inferring, based on the information I'm reading, that they don't have comprehensive visibility on these production networks. And that, because otherwise they would have found the root cause more quickly, is my assessment based on the limited knowledge that that I have, from what's been publicly shared. And so that's why I think comprehensive visibility on these systems should form an essential part of any cyber incident risk management plan. But it's not just about the tech. I find the biggest barrier to driving these programs is actually the right stakeholder engagement of those OT asset owners and having the right processes in place to work together with cyber and OT to reduce the risk of a cyber incident affecting safety and production within that system.
So, Leon, technology is always changing, as we discussed with the ongoing evolution of digital transformation. So what is the best way to future-proof your strategy so that operators are prepared for these evolving threats, able to detect them in real time, and stay as protected as possible and as needed?
Yeah, so Alex, it's a question I get every day when I'm talking to our customers. And CPS cybersecurity is a long-term journey, and many organizations I talk to are still early on that journey and still in the discovery phase where they'll admit to me, look, we don't know what we don't know. And so the key things I advocate for people at this stage of the journey is to focus on building a good working relationship with their OT counterparts, as this is essential to drive these initiatives. And to commence their journey when it comes to selecting technology, to focus on firstly having a very good inventory of the cyber physical assets in those CPS environments. The reason for this is you can't protect what you don't know about. And without an asset inventory, you won't be able to drive an effective OT cybersecurity program because you won't know what you need to protect. Only once you've got that asset inventory sorted, which, by the way, is a great way to engage those OT stakeholders because they won't know 100% of what's actually in their live network. So that's value for them straight off the bat before you even talk about cybersecurity. But once you've got that asset inventory sorted, the knowledge you gain in that process will help you assess your next set of priorities as you progress on your cybersecurity journey in your cyber physical systems.
A friend owned a restaurant and a new chef came in, and the first thing he did was ordered all of the workers in the kitchen to do a thorough cleaning of the kitchen. It was like an audit of everything, and I mean, it took a new person to come along. But it just makes me think, the next obvious question is, well, what are Claroty's solutions for these issues?
Yeah, well, glad you asked, Alex. And look, I'd preface this by saying technology doesn't solve all the problems. Technology probably plays 20% of the role.
Yeah. And
what we've seen, we talked to a lot of customers who maybe bought something else and, never really got it off the ground. I'm sure, all sizes out there have, bought a technology that ended up being shelved for at some point. For these kinds of initiatives, it's really critical to have the right engagement with those stakeholders at the plants. Otherwise, you're not going to get the right cooperation to put a technology in place, but also to leverage the value generated from the data the technology is providing. But when it comes to technology, that's Claroty's primary focus, is investing in the right technology. And we provide the technology to automate and streamline this asset discovery and risk assessment so you don't have to do that effort manually, and you can continually monitor how that's been updated, and when you make a change on the network, how the risk profile's gone down. One of the key interesting things I see when I talk to customers is, having to deal with thousands and thousands of vulnerabilities and not knowing where to start. Claroty helps organizations prioritize their exposures to focus on the handful that have known exploits that are reachable and will have a business impact. Because vulnerability and exposure remediation in the OT world is a lot more cumbersome and slow process in the IT world, because people are very reluctant to push these kinds of updates in an automated fashion because of the business impact that could occur. So we also provide those remediation recommendations, because in cyber physical systems, patching may not be that first course of action to remediate a key exposure. And rather than trying to get to the end of a list of 1,000 exposures, you can focus on the top 3 or 5 and make a meaningful risk reduction. When it comes to addressing the evolving requirements for accessing these systems in a more secure manner, Claroty also provides a Purdue and 62443 compliant secure access mechanism that delivers secure, auditable connectivity and secure file transfer into these environments. So when people are making changes to these networks, they're doing it in a corporate sanctioned safe manner, versus what we typically see in the so-called air-gapped environments where there's 3G modems hidden in cupboards and things like that nobody knows about it. So Claroty really gives our customers a comprehensive platform to protect their cyber physical systems. But as I mentioned at the beginning, the right technology is useless unless you have the right people and process to drive those full business benefits. which we counsel our customers to focus their attention on and work through how they adopt the technology in the right way to get the right business outcome.
Yeah, you've got to have the plan. You've got to have everyone on board so it can be implemented properly. And the whole "if it ain't broke, don't fix it" mentality just doesn't work anymore in the 21st century.
That's right.
Yeah. So what else do we need to know, and how will these threats evolve through to 2030 and beyond?
Yeah, so what I'd say is try not to get fancy, especially when you're starting out. The keys to success are really about getting the basics right. Adopt a zero trust approach to accessing and updating these systems, get comprehensive asset visibility, and make your OT counterparts co-owners of this journey so you get the cooperation you need to drive an effective program. If we look over the next 5 years to 2030 and beyond, I'm expecting a lot more attacks leveraging AI with things like cyber poisoning of AI data sets. And I'm expecting to see a lot more nation-state initiated attacks affecting critical infrastructure and supply chain. For those who want to do a bit of home reading, take a look at some of the information that's been released about Volt Typhoon, who are a nation-state sponsored hacking group who have been found to be nesting in a lot of American and it seems also Australian critical infrastructure. They're not launching attacks yet because they're preparing in a warfare type situation, and that's when they would launch their attacks. This is what we can expect in a modern warfare landscape. And I think the Department of Home Affairs and other federal government agencies have done a really good job so far educating the general public and putting the right frameworks in place for organizations who operate this critical infrastructure to protect the systems that we all rely on to go about our day-to-day lives.
Well, look, I always like to learn a little bit about the people that I'm interviewing. So as we near the end of this interview, I like to ask a couple of personal questions. And my first is if you could please share a memory of your first personal computer from all those years ago.
That's a great question, Alex. I'm a 90s kid. My first computer was a used Amiga 500 that my parents got secondhand when I was about 8.
Yeah.
Didn't have a hard drive and everything booted straight from floppy disks. My grandfather actually also used an Amiga back in the early 90s for video editing. He'd never used a computer until he was in his late 60s. And then he was doing all sorts of video editing, that even today, I think people would be surprised what can be achieved with very little hardware. Things have certainly come a long way. And now that I've got children of my own who are more digital natives, I'm trying to teach them that technology it's just not the tool and it doesn't replace our whole lives. But some days that feels like a losing battle. Yes.
Well, I mean, like I was saying before, you've got the situation where when we were kids, if the power or the electricity went out, there was a bit of concern and panic. But in the modern era, it's if the Wi-Fi goes out, and then of course if the AI systems go out, what am I going to copy and paste from for my homework? So it's all about people, whether they're children or adults, not being taught what to think, but being taught how to think. And critical thinking is important when you're trying to secure a very broad range of OT and physical and cyber assets, which are becoming the absolute cornerstones of our lives. And with that Volt Typhoon, sitting there waiting, to attack at some point where there's a larger war. I mean, this is more important than ever.
That's right.
So what sparked your interest in cybersecurity?
Well, I fell into cybersecurity somewhat by accident back in 2012 when I was looking for a new challenge and joined a cybersecurity integrator. But looking back, I think I was always going to be well suited to this kind of industry. Since my mid-20s, and I was a big fan of Nassim Taleb's work on risk. I had a great interest in those risk-reward metrics and understanding how to manage risk in an effective way, while also reducing the probability of a catastrophic risk event occurring, which is certainly the sorts of things we think about when we're talking about critical infrastructure. So CPS cyber risk, I think, is another level on cybersecurity because we're now looking at how cyber risk can impact the safety and production risk of these critical systems that we all rely on to live our modern lives. So it's always, it's been a genuine interest. And if I hadn't fallen into cybersecurity by accident, going back 13 years, I probably would have gotten into it another way.
And my second last question is to ask if you could please share some of the best advice that you've received in life to help you get where you are today.
Well, it's pretty simple. Work hard, do the right thing, get to know as many people as you can, and be trustworthy and reliable. I wrote a book a few years ago called The Trust Matrix, and I think the best way for a young person to progress in their careers is to get in as many situations as possible where they can show themselves to be reliable and get to know as many people as possible. So your reputation is built and then spread amongst that network, and you're going to find new opportunities emerge that you never would have heard about otherwise. I find a good reputation will take you far, and every action you take is like another deposit in the bank account of your reputation. It's simple, but it's not always easy to do. And the world is rapidly changing with new technology and AI, but I think this is something that's never going to change.
Yes, a good reputation takes years to build and it can be destroyed in a second. So very important to be trustworthy and do a good job.
That's right.
So Leon, what is your final message to the viewers and the readers?
Well, all I have to close on is that cyber physical systems are everywhere and operate more and more of the critical things we rely on to live our modern lives. As this digital transformation accelerates, it's going to need an adaptable approach with the right people working together to protect these systems we all rely on. This is what we do every day when we work at Claroty, but the technology alone won't get you there. You need the right people and processes to protect this infrastructure. And our mission is to help customers navigate that journey so they can safeguard the critical infrastructure we'll rely on to live our daily lives.
Well, I'm glad you're there, Leon. It's, companies like Claroty and I guess the industry that is working together to keep us safe and secure. Life would be very different if we didn't have all of our modern digital conveniences, and certainly I don't want to go back to the way it was 100 years ago. So
that's right.
Leon Poggioloi, Claroty's Regional Vice President for Australia and New Zealand, thank you so much for taking the time to discuss the cybersecurity risks facing our critical infrastructure sectors. And if you'd like more information, please go to claroty.com. So thank you, and I'll look forward to speaking with you again in the future.
Thank you, Alex. Great to be here.
Thank you. Bye-bye.